Hey guys, it's Sports213 here, and today we're going to be going over the top position players in Fantasy Football 2025 for 2025 season going into Week 6, or in other words, after Week 5. So, starting with last week's top position players, the top scoring QB from last week in fantasy is CJ Stroud. He had 28.76 fantasy points in the Texans' blowout win against the Ravens. Now, the next closest to him that week was Dak Prescott, but CJ Stroud had .48 fantasy points more than Dak. So, yep. Anyways, the top running back in fantasy last week. This is a major surprise to everyone. Rico Dowdle, of all running backs, is the top scoring running back last week for fantasy with 32.4 fantasy points in the Panthers' comeback win against the Dolphins. Now, there were two other running backs that also scored over 30 or more fantasy points last week, in which Jonathan Taylor had 31.6 fantasy points in the Colts blowout win against the Raiders, and Kyren Williams had 31.1 fantasy points in the Rams' loss on Thursday night, this past Thursday, to the Niners. The top scoring receiver in fantasy last week was Emeka Egbuka of the Bucks. He had 31.3 fantasy points in that high-scoring game against the Seahawks, in which both teams wore their throwback jerseys. Yep, that honors their 50th seasons. Yep, their 5 decades of existence for both those teams. And speaking of the Seahawks, yep, A.J. Barner, it was the highest-scoring tight end in fantasy last week, as he had 24.3 fantasy points for finish at the top spot for tight ends last week. How about that? Yep. A game that involves both teams wearing their throwback jerseys just to have two players as like one of the top position players from last week. Now for teams defense and special teams, yep, the Saints defense and special teams had 18 fantasy points in their win against the Giants, and this is the Saints' first win of the season. Yep, we always do that whenever teams win their first games of the season. And the top scoring kicker in fantasy for last week was Kaimi Fairbairn for the Texans, and he had 18 fantasy points. The same as the Saints team's defense and special teams. But the overall position leaders have almost stayed the same from last week, but the only difference is that for the team's defense and special teams is now both the Vikings and Lions sharing that top spot with 48 fantasy points each for both those teams' defense and special teams. But with the Vikings on bye this week, they have the week off. We could expect the Lions to take over as the top team's defense and special teams if those units keep playing wood. And the Seahawks team's defense and special teams were the top ones overall last week. But due to that high-scoring game they had against the Bucks, yeah, that's what happens when you're involved in a high-scoring game. So, yep. And then for kicker, unfortunately, Spencer Strider going into Week 5, he was the top kicker in fantasy. He is out for the season, unfortunately. Yep, this is just sad for him. For him being the top kicker in fantasy for the first 4 weeks, and he was one of the big surprises, his surprise season comes to an end in the saddest way possible. So now Brandon Aubrey takes over as the top kicker in fantasy, and who knows how long he'll have that top spot for kickers. Because the other guys that could catch up to him potentially, with Schrader out for the season, McLaughlin and Fairbairn at this point. But we'll see what happens with some of the other kickers too. Yep. Josh Allen is the top QB in fantasy for the second straight week. I mean, the only one that's just right behind him is Mahomes. So Josh Allen has 117.88 fantasy points, which leads all QBs. Top running back, Christian McCaffrey. He still is for second straight week with 123.9 fantasy points. Right behind him is Jonathan Taylor, just by 2 points, similar to Mahomes being 2 points behind Josh Allen. And still, the top receiver in fantasy is Puka. Yep. He now has 134 fantasy points, which leads all players in fantasy. And for the fourth straight week, he is the top receiver in fantasy. Might as well be the top receiver in fantasy for pretty much the rest of the season, because the next closest is Amon-Ra by 22 points. And yeah, this is pretty much Puka's spot for the season. Yep. But we'll see what happens the rest of the way. And then the top tight end, Jake Ferguson, he has 20 more fantasy points than the next closest tight end, which is Dalton Kincaid, sitting at like 66 fantasy points, around there. And this is the third straight week that Jake Ferguson is the top tight end in fantasy. Anyways, hopefully you'll enjoyed me going over the top position players for fantasy going into week 6. In other words, after week 5. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to join the Sports Nation. And see you guys later.